You're listening to Think Deep,
a podcast by the Deep-Ocean Stewardship Initiative.
We are a global network of experts
working at the intersection of science,
policy, and community
to guide stewardship of the deep ocean.
Through engagement with policymakers,
building global capacity,
and fostering collaboration.
Our core team and ambassadors
help shape policies that protect deep ocean ecosystems,
which are vital to sustaining life on Earth.
Join us as we dive into the science,
governance, and stories
shaping the future of our ocean.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Think Deep, decoding deep ocean science and policy. This podcast series takes you behind the scenes to explore how scientific research influences laws, decisions, and protections for the deep ocean. Join us as we dive into the science, challenges, and people working towards a sustainable ocean future. I'm your host, Michelle Gurayeb, an oceanographer with a passion for the deep ocean and its connection to our lives. Today, we are exploring areas beyond national jurisdiction, or ABNJ. Who governs these waters? Who gets to use their resources? And how do we protect what we can't even see? Join us as we unpack the laws, the loopholes, and the future of the high seas with Pradeep Singh, an expert in international law of the sea and a member of the Oceano Azul Foundation. Welcome to the podcast, Pradeep.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
What inspired you to work in ocean governance? Was there a moment when you realized this is what I want to dedicate my career to?
Yeah, I was born and I grew up in Malaysia in an island called Penang, surrounded by the sea. But it was only when I moved to East Malaysia, to Borneo for work, that I really started to connect with the ocean, spending time snorkeling in some of the beautiful areas in East Malaysia. That really sort of made me inspired or really moved me to focus in this area. And that sort of led me to specialize in the law of the sea. And when I was taking my master's courses, specifically on ocean governance, that's when I was really drawn into certain topics, including the deep ocean. And I guess it also helps that I have deep in my name, Pradeep. So maybe all those factors together brought me closer to this topic. And I guess at some point decided that this is what I was born for. And this is what I wanted to dedicate my career to.
I love that. I hadn't made the connection with your name, Pradeep. That's awesome.
Yeah, at one point in time, I was saying, as DOSI's slogan is "Think Deep," I always also say "Think Deep, Think Pradeep." Why not?
And we're definitely going to be thinking Pradeep today. So you were interested in the ocean from an early age, and then what interested you in law?
I guess I was more inspired by my father, who himself was a lawyer. But then throughout the years, as I was, first initially working more on commercial law and then other areas of law, it was when I moved to East Malaysia, to Borneo, and started to learn more about environmental law, indigenous law, and natural resources law. I think the rest is history. I just decided to pursue my master's in the law of the sea, in environmental law and climate law, because I felt that those were some of the areas of law, at least at that point in time, about 10 years ago, that was, underrepresented and needed more contribution from experts and from lawyers who hopefully could perhaps make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's a great combination when you learn about law and love the ocean. People who have those two passions, great, because we need that.
Absolutely. I can't agree more.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly are areas beyond national jurisdiction, or ABNJ?
So in the context of ocean governance, when we say areas beyond national jurisdiction, essentially we're talking about areas that fall beyond the limits of the maritime zones that fall within the rights and interests of coastal states.
Okay, so no one country owns these areas of the ocean. And can you walk us through how ocean spaces are divided up legally? Like who controls what parts of the seabed and the water column above the seabed?
Sure. Coastal states claim exclusive economic zones up to 200 nautical miles from the coast, essentially. At the same time, coastal states can also claim 200 nautical miles of the seabed, and in some cases, even beyond that, maybe even up to 350 nautical miles, that could be not entirely within their territory, but within their jurisdiction. So they don't own the exclusive economic zone, or they don't own the continental shelf, so to speak, beyond 12 nautical miles, because the first 12 nautical miles, that's the territorial sea. So it's part of the territory of the coastal state. But beyond that, what goes into the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf, that's where states have sovereign rights to exploit the resources that are there, living and non-living, but they don't actually own the space. So they can't really restrict activities like navigation and so on. But when it comes to economic rights to exploit resources, the coastal states would have sovereign rights over the resources found on the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf. And whatever lies beyond the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf within national jurisdiction, that is what is known as areas beyond national jurisdiction.
So just to recap, coastal states don't own the ocean past 12 nautical miles, but they do have special rights to use the resources up to 200 miles out, and sometimes even farther on the seabed, right?
Yes, so it's not part of their territory, but if they wish to exploit resources there, then they may do so. And no other country can do that unless they reach out to the coastal state and reach some sort of agreement. But otherwise, it's just exclusively the coastal state that has rights to exploit the resources on the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf within its jurisdiction.
And can anyone sail those waters?
Yes. So the freedom of navigation, that's the term that is used, that is preserved on the exclusive economic zone. There's also the freedom to, for instance, lay submarine cables on the seafloor, because that doesn't affect the right of the state to exploit resources. If there is a conflict, of course, there needs to be some sort of negotiation with the coastal state. So it's quite typical that coastal states would declare certain areas of high fishing intensity. So shipping lanes will be created in order to not overlap with areas where there are such fishing activities that the coastal state is pursuing. And similarly, also, if there's any sort of offshore exploitation activities, coastal states would make that known so that if there's any interest to lay submarine cables, that should not overlap with the interests of the coastal states to exploit such resources.
So within the exclusive economic zone, there's this balance. Coastal states have rights over resources, but other activities like navigation and cables are still allowed. But once we move beyond those zones into areas beyond national jurisdiction or ABNJ, how is that space managed? Who makes the rules?
So there is no single body that governs ABNJ, but there are a few regimes that apply. And this is where it gets really interesting. There is difference between the high seas when we talk about the water column itself, the surface and the water column, and the international seabed area, which is called D area under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The main distinction being that when we speak about the high seas, currently what applies is the freedom of the high seas. So states have the freedom to use the high seas. No particular state can exclude other states from using the high seas or utilizing the high seas. This is in contrast with the exclusive economic zone that we spoke about earlier, where the coastal state has exclusive economic rights. Here in the high seas, no one state has any sort of exclusive rights. Now, I say freedom of the high seas, but that doesn't mean free for all, or, it's the wild, wild west or something like that. You still have what is called flag state jurisdiction. So ships that operate on the seas, they need to have a flag or be flagged to a particular country. And it's that flag state that exercises jurisdiction and responsibility over ships or vessels that fly its flag. And so these ships and vessels are bound to follow laws and regulations that the flag state imposes on them. And if something goes wrong, it's the flag states that have responsibility to ensure that the ships and the vessels are accountable and to take legal action against those actors that may have caused damage or done something that is illegal.
And what activities would be considered illegal in the high seas?
The movement of drugs, for instance, that's illegal, or piracy, for instance, that's illegal. And so all states are actually bound under international law to curb and to take action against activities like that. But other forms of freedoms that tend to apply are navigation, fisheries, laying of submarine cables. Those are what we mean by freedom of the high seas.
Okay, so we've talked about the high seas, mostly the water column, but now we're diving down, literally to the seafloor, and that's governed by a whole different system.
Now, in contrast to the high seas, we have this special regime, I guess, for the international seabed area. And here we're specifically talking about non-living resources, basically mineral resources. And under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the area and its mineral resources are the common heritage of humankind. And for that purpose, an organization known as the International Seabed Authority was established. And it's this body that has jurisdiction over the administration of mineral resources on the international seabed area. So we have one term, areas beyond national jurisdiction, but two regimes, one for the high seas and one for the international seabed area. And one, you have the freedom of the high seas, and on the other one, you have the common heritage of humankind.
It helps a lot to break it down that way.
And perhaps to add also that in cases where there is the extended continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, where states may have exclusive rights to exploit resources, non-living resources on the seabed, they don't actually have the equivalent exclusive rights on the water column that's above the extended continental shelf, because that falls under the high seas.
That overlapping jurisdiction sounds tricky for conservation.
Absolutely.
On that note, can you tell us what the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, or the BBNJ Treaty, is, and why it's such an important step for marine conservation, especially in areas beyond national jurisdiction?
Yeah, so the BBNJ agreement was negotiated or has been in the making for about 20 years until its eventual adoption a couple of years ago. But there was a gap in the sense that, there was no collective mechanism among states to take measures for conservation on the high seas. The other aspect to it was that, there was also a gap in terms of, of course, we have fisheries that happen on the high seas, but what about marine genetic resources? And that was something that was not really thought about when the Convention on the Law of the Sea was negotiated and agreed in 1982.
And just to explain to our listeners, marine genetic resources refer to genetic material from marine life, like deep-sea sponges, microbes, or even corals. And these can have unique properties with huge potential for things like medicine, biotechnology, or even cosmetics. And for context, Pradeep is referring to these because until now, there haven't been clear international rules for how these are accessed or how the benefits are shared.
And so, since the last 2 decades, states have been coming together, trying to convince each other of the need to create some sort of a regime for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that led to a dedicated negotiating forum to come up with a new agreement, which concluded 2 years ago when states adopted this BBNJ agreement.
As of 2025, 50 countries have ratified the agreement, just 10 short of the 60 needed for it to enter into force. So the question is, what happens when we reach that threshold?
Once it enters into force, it would allow states to come together to agree on things like, how to access and what to do with benefits that are generated from marine genetic resources use. But it would also allow states to agree on creating protected areas on the high seas, for instance, areas that are in need of protection from activities like fisheries and so on, which up until the adoption of this agreement was something that was difficult to do. I think you've had some regimes that try to declare certain areas as important, but were not able to give legal effect to it. But the BBNJ agreement would be able to give legal force to any sort of area-based management tools, including protected areas on the high seas.
It's amazing to think we've never had a binding way to create protected areas in the high seas until now. And for those of us who aren't international lawyers, what does it actually mean when a country signs a treaty versus ratifying it?
So usually when a treaty is adopted, the first step would be that it's open for signature within a certain time. And then it would also be open for ratification. Now, the difference between signing a treaty and then the second step of ratification is simply that when it comes to signing of a treaty, it's usually the government that decides whether or not to sign a treaty. And before the step can be taken to ratify a treaty, that would then be brought back into the domestic legal processes of the state, for instance, to parliament, to agree that the state actually binds itself to that agreement. This is something that has been quite historic under international law, that a government or a ruling party of a government cannot bind the state to international agreements. It needs to be endorsed by the parliament as a whole. And only then, once that process is completed, can an instrument of ratification be made. And then consequently, the country or state would be legally bound once that ratification process has happened to adhere to what is in the treaty. But that, of course, only applies if the treaty comes into force.
And what makes a treaty come into force?
In some cases, it can just be simply the number of countries that have ratified it. But in other cases, there can be additional conditions, like when it comes to shipping, it's not just the number of countries that ratify it, but also the number of tonnage of those shipping countries. That's also something that needs to be factored in. Once a country has signed an agreement, there is already the expectation that it would meet the objectives of that agreement and not undermine the agreement that it has signed. And that also is the case once ratification takes place, but before that agreement enters into force. But once it enters into force, then it becomes legally operative, and then the state is bound under international law to meet its obligations therein.
That's really helpful to understand. So even before the treaty officially enters into force, countries that sign are expected to start aligning with its goals. So let's jump to a different topic now. What are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to managing the high seas, especially with so many different governing bodies involved, each working on, different aspects of ocean use and protection?
Well, the biggest challenge, of course, is working in isolation from each other and not speaking to each other. We need more communication, more coherence across the different bodies, of course, respecting their individual mandates. But I think all the bodies that have some sort of a mandate or responsibility in areas beyond national jurisdiction have a common interest of ensuring the protection of the marine environment, of ensuring that whatever activities that fall within their remit do not cause unnecessary or unacceptable harm. On the other hand, plenty of opportunities really for them to collaborate with each other and ensure that they mutually reinforce each other and help with enforcement activities, as well as increasing ambition across the various instruments, frameworks, and bodies that operate in areas beyond national jurisdiction. It's not necessarily the same countries that feature in all these instruments and frameworks and bodies. Of course, the composition would differ. But that's where it helps to have conventions like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is, to a very large extent broadly accepted and can be the sort of unifying factor to ensure that all these instruments, frameworks, and bodies speak to each other. And hopefully the BBNJ Agreement would, reach such level of acceptance and perhaps even more, so that it would also be an effective way forward.
Amazing. And from your experience, what role do you think scientists, academics, or conservation advocates can or should play in these kinds of negotiations?
I think it's very important to get involved in the process. It's important to bring our knowledge, our expertise, as well as our values and our priorities to these various ocean fora where negotiations are happening. Because I think to a large extent, states are open and willing to learn and to listen. In fact, because of how government officials work, there is the tendency of, new people coming in and rotation and stuff like that. There's always plenty of delegates that want to learn more, including those that perhaps have not been following the history of such negotiations. And I've noticed, or at least realized personally, that it's always important to attend these negotiations and to refresh the minds of delegates.
So it's not just about looking ahead with science. It's also about remembering the history behind these agreements so we don't lose sight of why they were created in the first place. And for listeners who may not be directly involved in ocean governance, why should they care about what happens in areas beyond national jurisdiction? And how can listeners stay informed and involved in deep ocean governance?
It's very important to care about what happens in areas beyond national jurisdiction because of the interconnected nature of the ocean. We only have one ocean and it's all interconnected. And so what happens in areas beyond national jurisdiction will certainly affect us. It's a global commons. It's something that we should all have a say in terms of who accesses these resources and who benefits, the equity of it, to ensure that everyone benefits as opposed to just a handful benefiting and everyone else bearing the burdens that come out of such activities. So it's very important to ensure that even though it's that far out, that we don't lose sight of it and that we take all action that we can to protect and preserve these priceless ecosystems that basically sustain us, whether through climate regulation or through food provision and many other areas. And to listeners who would like to learn more, I think there are ample ways to keep abreast. I think there are increased reporting on ocean negotiations that one could follow by subscribing to mailing lists. But also, if you're a scientist or a researcher, I would say think deep and join DOSI as well and use DOSI as a platform to engage, to reach out, and to participate in these processes.
Thank you so much, Pradeep, for this conversation. I learned so much about law, and I'm sure our listeners will too.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you everyone who's listening.
And stay tuned for our next episode where we explore the concept of scale and why it matters for protection and management of the deep ocean. And don't forget to check the show notes for resources that might interest you. Until next time. Thank you to our funders, Arcadia, Synchronicity Earth, the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory, and the University of Southampton for their support. Think Deep is produced by DOSI with support from David Benjamin Sound.